the starting point is to recognise, as Acharya does, that the tectonic plates have shifted. The world we're looking at is not the same world that it was in those immediate post-Cold War years when the Security Council leadership was constructed and the veto rights were given to a small group of players who continue to occupy those positions, when so many other players, particularly from the so-called global south, have completely changed their standing. I mean, all of them clamouring for attention in the global order, and all of them pretty much excluded from key decision-making roles. And there's a natural instinct, and we're seeing this, of course, coming particularly loudly from China, to demand to be no longer just rule takers in that global order, but rule makers. And I think we've just got to come to terms with that reality.
Welcome, everyone. This is Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive, and I have a very special guest with me today. It's the former Foreign Minister of Australia and President of the International Crisis Group, Gareth Evans. Gareth, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Of course, we're meeting on May the 8th, shortly after the Australian federal election. And while many, many things are going on in the world right now, you were Foreign Minister of Australia between 1988 and 1996, and then President of the International Crisis Group during a very tumultuous time, but also in I think you've written in the past, also a very optimistic time, the end of the Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union, maybe not so optimistic from all angles. Then you were also involved in nuclear disarmament, chemical weapons conventions, and the United Nations peace plan for Cambodia. We seem to be in a time of similar major change at the moment, and there's lots of people out there on YouTube, where most people will be watching this, who like to comment on geopolitics, but very few with your level of senior, high-level diplomatic experience commenting on geopolitics. I wonder if maybe we could just start by giving viewers a sense of what it's actually like to be a foreign minister, to be in the room while such momentous changes like, the early 1990s, late 1980s are happening.
Well, let's begin by distinguishing between the tumult of my period as Foreign Minister and active engagement in foreign affairs and the tumult that exists right now, because they are very, very distinct. Back then, there was a spirit of optimism. The Cold War ice floes had well and truly broken. There was a spirit of cooperation evident among the great powers in the Security Council and elsewhere. There was a willingness to work together in the Asian region to build security and economic cooperative architecture in APEC, ASEAN Regional Forum, and so on. There was a willingness multilaterally to engage in serious arms control issues, including in particular on the nuclear front. There's a willingness to work together to dramatically draw down the nuclear arsenals of the respective major nuclear powers. Above all, I think that spirit was embraced in, for example, the Cambodian peace process, and it's worthwhile just spending a moment to describe that, because at the time, this was a classic Cold War problem demanding a new, completely innovative solution. We had China supporting the Khmer Rouge, Russia supporting through Vietnam Hun Sen's regime. We had the ASEAN countries supported by the United States, supporting in turn the internal players, the royalists, Sihanouk crowd, and so on. It was just extraordinarily difficult conflict to resolve in the aftermath of the genocide. There was a raging civil war. But the environment was there in which a solution was found. Australia led the way in devising that solution by identifying the United Nations as the key to the success of the enterprise, giving in short, China a face-saving way by accepting a role for the United Nations of an unprecedented complexity in the transition process, giving China a face-saving way of withdrawing its support for the Khmer Rouge and everything else then falling into place. So that was just a classic example of the way in which the environment was one of optimism. The environment was one of getting things done and getting things done cooperatively. Compare now, we're back in a very difficult environment indeed, in which pessimism has become the dominant motif. Great power rivalry is back absolutely in force. The deadlock in the Security Council, as use of the veto powers, is absolutely back in force. There's a demonstrable inability to address intractable conflict situations or ugly conflict situations. Russia, Ukraine, conspicuous among them. Gaza, of course, dramatically awful, but also Sudan, Congo, Myanmar in our own region. Just all of those peace processes completely frozen, going nowhere at the moment, and an atmosphere of general desolation. On the economic front, you've got Trump waging his trade war, reversion of protectionist instincts, trade barriers going up, and an environment in which it's much more difficult for countries like Australia to exercise any influence at all. So that's what we're confronting, and that's what we've got to untangle, I suppose, in the rest of this discussion, how we navigate that. But you asked about what it's like being in the room, the foreign minister. Well, it's an absolutely fascinating experience. Certainly, of all the different roles that I've played in my public professional life over the last 40, 50 years, I mean, that was unequivocally the most stimulating, the most fascinating, the most engaging, the most demanding. I mean, the issues are just extraordinarily complex. You're constantly reacting to events. You wake up in the morning just not knowing what's going to be on your plate, and there's no other portfolio in government that has that constant, stream of things coming at you, which demand some kind of reaction. Now, there's two ways, I guess, of addressing this. One is to just to be there, to not make anything worse, to focus on developing as friendly as possible relationships with the countries that matter to you, and just generally not making any waves and hoping that nobody will make too many waves for you. That's one way of approaching it. The other way is, of course, to be much more proactive, to say to see the role as having the opportunity, if the environment is kind enough to give you that opportunity, to do a lot more adventurous and creative things. And I think Australia was very active in that period in a whole variety of contexts, some of which we've already mentioned in passing: the Cambodia peace process, Chemical Weapons Convention, developing this regional architecture, APEC and ASEAN Regional Forum, and so on, and just generally being and advocating and new thinking about nuclear disarmament as well as non-proliferation through the creation of a Canberra Commission, a whole bunch of things we were doing in an environment which was very susceptible to that. I mean, some of the, what matters, I think, above all else, in the conduct of foreign policy, whatever the environment you're in, is really to an extraordinary extent the personal relationships that you can develop with others, whether you can develop a warm and trusting relationship of the kind that I had conspicuously with Ali Alatas, my Indonesian counterpart, which mattered enormously in terms of our capacity to work together on the Cambodian brief, but also just generally to create an environment in which people will listen to what you've got to say, and even if you've got some quite difficult conversations to have about human rights or other issues, nonetheless you can conduct those discussions in a way that is mutually sort of respectful and sometimes quite productive. I mean, a lot of it is just sort of trivial stuff. I mean, you play golf with people. I mean, I play very bad golf, but nonetheless, it was just an incredible male bonding environment, particularly with my ASEAN colleagues, but also with Jim Baker, the US Secretary of State. I mean, you would just spend time with people, not so much talking endlessly about the current problems of the day, but just talking about golf and just building those personal relationships of confidence. And I think the nicest thing anyone ever said to me during my whole period as foreign minister was in the course of one of those big conferences we were having on the Cambodian peace process, in which during a coffee break I wandered down a corridor looking for an empty room to make a private phone call, and opened the door to stumble upon 4 or 5 of my ASEAN colleagues having a coffee around a table. I said, "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt." Da, 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 da. And they said, no, come on in. You're one of us. Come on, you're one of us. Yeah. Now, to be able to develop that kind of working relationship, personal relationship as well as professional relationship with those countries that meant then and mean now so much to us, was one of the most important, I think, things you can do as foreign minister, and certainly one of the things that I was most delighted to be able to achieve. So it's a very complex job. It demands a huge investment of time if you're going to be proactive, particularly. I mean, I was reading hundreds of pages of cables every day coming in from all over the world just to keep track of the dynamics of these different situations. And those were back in the days when diplomats were actually writing those sorts of cables, which doesn't seem to happen much anymore. But it was also less demanding in terms of the social media and all the rest of it. And the news cycles you had to deal with. But it was an extraordinarily engaging time, an extraordinarily exciting time, and very much more difficult now for my current generation of counterparts. But there we are.
Yeah, indeed. And it might be interesting to reflect on sort of changing culture of politics, maybe, or institutional environment for politics later. But there's a lot of talk in think tank world, and I guess people commenting on geopolitics about grand strategies. And how did you approach, I guess, combining relationships, the immediate responses to events, all the pressures on you, and sort of trying to go in some sort of, coherent direction towards a set of objectives?
Yeah, I thought it was very important to approach my task as foreign minister not just in a sort of scattergun way, but to think pretty carefully about the broad conceptual framework and within which I was operating. And essentially, I spent the first couple of months as foreign minister trying to articulate that in a series of major speeches in a way which did irritate some of my academic colleagues who kept saying, well, that's all very interesting, but when are you going to say something that actually matters and is meaningful? But it was meaningful to me because what I was trying to do was essentially this. First of all, to define with some precision what Australia's interests, national interests actually were. Everybody still agrees that your security from physical threat and your prosperity are the bedrock duo around which every country's national interest and efforts necessarily revolve. But my argument, my conception right from the beginning was that there's a third category of national interest, and that was what I called the national interest in being seen to be a good international citizen. We'll come back to this a bit later on, but what I mean by that is being seen to be the kind of country that is not just totally preoccupied with immediate self-interest and immediate security returns and economic returns, but is genuinely compassionate, genuinely recognizing of our global common humanity, generally recognizing a need to be an effective player when it comes to delivering aid, supporting human rights, supporting peacemaking, peacekeeping, dealing with the consequences of war and atrocity crimes through refugee outflows and so on. And of course, dealing also with those big existential risk issues like climate, although that wasn't such a big issue then as it's become now, pandemics, but nuclear warfare in particular, which dealing with those big existential issues which might involve a degree of sort of national sacrifice to get common agreement on issues where your own interests might not immediately be in favour of taking some action. But I saw all these things as being both a moral imperative and a national interest imperative. It wasn't just Boy Scout good deeds. I saw this as generating, reputational return. I saw it as generating reciprocal attention to our own interests and needs in a way that might not be in other countries' immediate interest, but the principle of reciprocity. And I saw it as an important way of creating an environment in which cooperative things could be done and addressing those big problems, which the collective action problems, which do need no one country, however big or powerful, can solve themselves. They can only be addressed through cooperative support. So the first part of my conceptual approach, then as now, is identifying national interests in a broad-based way with not just the two traditional categories, but three categories, as I've just described. And the second thing is to identify with some precision what your capabilities are, what your potential ability to actually advance those interests actually is. And the reality is that in the real world, middle powers have certain capabilities of coalition building if they're active and adventurous, creative in the way in which they pursue their diplomacy. But you can't do everything, so you've got to temper that with the recognition that what I call niche diplomacy is probably going to be the name of the game for middle powers like Australia, focusing on things where you can make a difference through that capacity for coalition building among the like-minded, essentially. And the final dimension in this sort of conceptual framework was just setting priorities. When you match your capabilities against your interests and the real world constraints that are out there, what can you actually sensibly focus your attention on? So that was the framework within which I operated. It was quite different from the way in which a lot of our foreign ministers have operated when they're asked what foreign policy is all about. They say, well, first of all, it's ensuring the stability of our relationship with the United States and the alliance. Secondly, it's about building our relationship with our regional neighbours, and thirdly, it's about support for, in the case of Labor Party anyway, support for the UN and other international institutions. Well, that's absolutely right. They are the sort of priorities that we've had, but that's not doing it in a way which helps you think about the tumultuous complexity of the conduct of foreign relations and the prospect of actually doing something a bit different than just minding the shop. So that was the approach that I adopted.
Indeed. And I think when Marco Rubio did his first interview as Secretary of State, he said foreign policy is all about national interest, whereas you're really saying it's about national interest in a broad concept as well as, I guess, global good or global citizenship, I think you've used the term.
Yeah. It's where idealism and realism, sort of coincide, because it's not just arguing for doing good deeds. It's not just arguing for the moral utility and necessity of acting in a certain way. It's arguing that doing good stuff in a very self-conscious way and trying to advance those good objectives, decent objectives, is something that redounds to your reputational and other advantage. It's the classic soft power argument.
Yeah.
National interest is not just about exercising hard power; it's about exercising soft power, and that's what's been pretty much lost, of course, in terms of the American perspective at the moment. But it's very important for Australia to keep, and other countries to keep a very firm eye on.
Yeah, indeed. I was going to ask about the current US administration, and not just, I guess, the Trump and the immediate individuals, but I guess the broad leadership cohort, I guess, if you like, in the United States. In recent months, there's been some events that seem to treat friends and allies in pretty aggressive ways. The event with Zelensky in the White House, the J.D. Vance's speech in Europe, Denmark and Greenland, all the rest of it, let alone the tariff policies. What's been your impression of how, over time, US diplomats, leading officials, leading politicians, military people interact with friends and allies, especially from the people without the guns, let's say, the middle powers.
Well, for countries like Australia, and certainly my experience, the United States relationship is always pretty tricky to navigate, because however decent and professional the particular individuals are with whom you're dealing, and there were plenty in that category during my period in office, Jim Baker, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, Warren Christopher, however decent and professional they were, there was always a degree of innate, let's face it, arrogance, a degree of belief that they're at the top of the tree, and the rest of the world needs to know its place in relation to that. With Trump in office, who of course is neither decent nor professional, and that similarly can be said of all those around him. Of course, it's tougher than ever, and this notion that allies are encumbrances rather than assets is very much part of his worldview. But even in the best of times, it was tricky. I mean, my relationship with James Baker, for example, one of the most professional and competent people ever to occupy that Secretary of State office, really was quite tricky. The very first meeting I ever had with him in Washington was a day or two after Bob Hawke had announced the APEC initiative that Australia proposed to take in terms of building a cooperative economic regime in the region, and in which we'd left the United States out of it. Because we thought the immediate task was to get support within the region, and then we would follow up with the Americans later. Well, I remember Baker, laying a big mark of Zorro on me in a hugely aggressive and tough-minded way. What do you guys think you are doing in treating us in this way? Da 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 da. Then, of course, as time went on, that relationship became, as I got to know him better, he got to know me better. And he got to sort of recognize the reality of what we could contribute to the pursuit of United States interests. The relationship became very, very warm. Most obviously, I guess, when we worked together to bring to fruition the Chemical Weapons Convention. And I remember Baker calling me up from a plane crossing the Atlantic at the time, and he said, "Look, you guys have been giving us a hard time lately on China issues, most favoured nation, God knows what else, and demonstrating that you're not going to be pushed around by us. Let me put to you a proposition which will take advantage of that position that you've carved out for yourself. You and I both want to see something happen with this chemical weapons convention negotiation, which has been stuck in Geneva for 10 or 15 years beforehand. We both want to get something done. We're too big and ugly," Baker said to me, to, in effect, almost those words, to carry that water ourselves. We'll be seen as too self-interested. But you can do it, in working with us and working for us and taking the lead on it. And so we did, and that was one of the big achievements of that particular period. But there was always this edge to it. There always is in dealing with the Americans. And another story I'll tell about Baker, and I told it a bit recently in the context of the issue about AUKUS, is that as dealing with them in the context of working with them in a kinetic, in a hot conflict situation. The occasion I'm thinking of was the first Gulf War, the good Gulf War, back in 1991, when you remember Security Council endorsed a military response to Iraq's indefensible invasion of Kuwait. Australia leapt into that particular fray. We were very willing to join the enterprise. We sent a couple of naval ships into the arena, along with some other personnel. What happened is when those ships arrived on station, as I remember it, they were ordered almost immediately by the Americans into a particularly vulnerable location where it could have rapidly ended in tears. So I rang Baker, my counterpart as Foreign Minister, and I said to him, "Jim, you know how much we're on board with this enterprise, and of course we understand strategic, tactical necessity, and tough decisions have sometimes got to be made. But But really, this could be pretty neuralgic for us politically here in Australia if things go pear-shaped. We really would have appreciated just a teensy bit of consultation before this was in.
I vaguely remember from the time it was a very because the government was still relatively new, and the sort of anti-American, let's say, element of the Labor Party was strong.
So what I said to him was exactly. So what I said to him was, look, just a teeny little bit of consultation would have been really appreciated, just to make things a bit easier. What he said to me in words to the extent that I can remember them, and I will bowdlerize a little bit. Listen, buddy, we're running this effing war, not you. Listen, buddy. And that's the reality. You always know your place in which you're going to be located in dealing with these big guys. And that's, of course, one of the big worries that I have about the AUKUS project. If we enmesh ourselves further with that embrace of American technology, we're going to lose what remaining sovereign agency independence we might think we have, and the use of that particular submarine asset in the future should things go ugly. So you've got to recognise that particular reality, that even at the best of times, when the relationship is working as well as it ever has, there is a real potential tension there and a real necessity for Australia to stand up for its own independent interests and not be completely rolled over by the need to accommodate the great and powerful friend.
How do you interpret or assess the current US government's sort of foreign policy stance towards the world, if I could use diplomatic language?
Well, it's almost totally incoherent. I mean, I think is what you have to say. There's three or four separate strands operating here. One is the purely isolationist, sort of America first dimension of it. Secondly is the familiar traditional triumphalist, primacy focused notion, make America great again, have us, as unquestioned, global top dog, able to exercise our authority wherever we want to without constraint. And thirdly, there's the purely sort of transactional Trump ego-driven dimension, which can take you in almost any direction on any issue at any time, and has left a lot of people just pondering what the hell is going on. If there's any coherence at all about the policy position of America as it's sort of emerging, I suppose it's got these dimensions. First of all, it's a clear sort of enthusiasm for a sphere of influence approach, where each of the great powers, and Trump perceives obviously America as such, China as such, and also somehow the Russia-European thing somewhere in the middle. Each of the great powers is having their own basic sphere of influence in which they can expect to be to do their thing without any particular pressure coming from outside. It's in that context that we've seen Trump's indifference about the extraordinary naked aggression in breach of every known principle of international law in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's somehow that sense that great powers will do their thing and the rest of us just should accommodate to that reality, and we'll certainly do our own thing in our own space. It's very ambiguous about how that's going to play out in the context of China, because there's still a lot of China hawks in his administration, but their voice has not been particularly strong at the moment. And if anything, Trump's instincts, I think, are to let China do its own thing, which is something that's making a lot of our regional neighbours, including a lot of elements here, a bit edgy. A second dimension of Trumpian foreign policy is a clear distaste for international institutions, any kind, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Court, just about any of those organisations, institutions, which are so critical for an effective, rules-based international order. Trump has no interest whatsoever in making any of these institutions strong and effective. He regards them essentially as encumbrances on great power, freedom of action, and that's, of course, very troubling. And the third dimension, I guess, of American foreign policy is a negative. It's just the lack of any sense of decency, lack of any sense that America's soft power matters, that it's important to be and be seen to be a decent country concerned about humanitarian needs and poverty and disaster relief in countries around the world where there's no obvious other more direct American interest at stake. And the collapse of the aid commitment, winding up at USA, AID, the obvious indifference to human rights, the obvious issues, the obvious indifference to peacemaking and peacekeeping roles and to atrocity crime perpetration and acting against perpetrators, war criminals. I mean, this is just a part of what we're dealing with. It's this, and it creates for a pretty troubling and a pretty difficult environment, obviously, not only for Australia but just about every other country that's wrestling with this reality.
You've argued for quite a few years, I wouldn't be able to say exactly how many years, but certainly a few years, that a principle that Australia should follow in foreign policy, and it's perhaps a principle that many countries around the world might be thinking about right now, is less America, more Asia. I mean, maybe that's two principles, but they sort of kind of go together. If we look at the less America part first, I guess you've to some degree answered why you might say that. But how do you think that could be acted on within Australia, or I guess in the more broad international context, even with other international institutions and other powers, other countries? How do you think that could be acted, maybe also with specific reference to AUKUS?
Yeah, well, my mantra in response to this environment we find ourselves in hasn't just got those two dimensions. It's got, in fact, four dimensions. There's less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, yes, and then more global engagement. Well, global engagement perhaps is in a slightly different category. We'll come to that later. But the three issues are interrelated. It's not just less America, more Asia. It's less America, more self-reliance, and more Asia. Why less America? Well, I think we just have to recognize the reality that we simply cannot rely, in security terms, the Americans to come to our assistance if we're in strife with any security threat bearing down upon us, unless the Americans see it as being very much in their own direct and immediate national interest, narrowly conceived, to do so. I think that's always been the case. There's always been a comforting fantasy in terms of our perception of the ANZUS Treaty as guaranteeing American support for us if we're in any kind of strife. That's never been a formal part of the treaty commitment. The obligation has only ever been to consult and to act, but not necessarily act in a way that is military. It's nothing like the rigor of NATO Article 5, for example, which requires people to act to meet the common danger militarily if any one of them is attacked. That's just never been the case, and it's certainly not the case now under Trump that we can even begin to rely on that American presence. And of course, that's accompanied by an economic situation where, as Albanese, said, I mean, the American imposition of so-called reciprocal tariffs on us was not the act of a friend. So, by less America, I mean primarily in a military context. This is what I'm talking about, and in that context, I'm not arguing that we walk away completely from the alliance. And some people saying, well, we'll just forget it and tear it up. We do benefit from it in terms of intelligence support. We do benefit from it, and have always benefited in terms of supply of defence gear of high technological sophistication, which we wouldn't otherwise perhaps have access to. And those things matter. And we've benefited to an extent from America's presence in the Asia-Pacific region as a kind of balancing wheel, and it's become more obviously important in the context of China's rise, but it's always been there, and it's always something which Australia has seen, along with most of the other countries in the region, as being to our mutual advantage as a stabilising dynamic. But we need to recognise that we just can't rely on that role being played in the future. And we have to respond, I think, in two ways. Just be very careful about further enmeshing ourselves in the American embrace in a way that might, quite dramatically further limit sovereign independence in the future. And that's the context in which I have a particular concern about AUKUS. I've got three major concerns. One is about the deliverability of these big beasts, the big, huge nuclear-powered boats that do have extraordinary capability, but realistically very, very unlikely to be delivered given the constraints of the American shipbuilding industry and the huge task that's involved in designing and building, with British engagement as well, a whole new class of boats. The second objection is a cost-benefit one. Whether the eye-watering expense of these big beasts is in fact justified by the return we'll get from them. Even if in 40 years' time we get 8 such boats, only 2 of them will be deployable at any one time, given the operational realities when dealing with these things. And what difference is that really going to make, given the vast maritime expanse around us? And would we not be better served by an approach which involved the building of much more Air Force capability, unmanned seaborne underwater capability, missile defence, cyber detection and response capability, all these things? There's a real argument there about whether the cost of these things is justified in terms of the actual security they will deliver, and whether there's alternative ways of spending that amount of money which would be far more relevant in an environment where, whatever the reality of the threat, we do need to develop capability for contingencies we can't presently anticipate. But the third objection to AUKUS is the one where the rubber to me really hits the road, and that's the question of sovereign agency, sovereign independence, the implication of developing such a degree of reliance on American technology that, frankly, it will only be supplied to us on the assumption on the American side that these boats will be available at the click of a presidential finger should Americans want them to be used in their support for some wartime adventure in which they're involved, whether it's in Australia's interests or not to get so involved. So, I think what we're doing with this is rather than, diminishing the risk to us, we're painting more targets on our back. And the irony is we're incurring this eye-watering cost to build a capability to meet threats which are most likely to arise because we're building that capability and using it in support of American military adventures. So the whole thing, just stepping back from that and focusing much more on building our own self-reliant capability is the name of the game. Developing what's some writers, Sam Roggeveen has recently described as the echidna principle. It's got to be an echidna that can also swim, because there's got to be a maritime dimension to it. But basically building enough prickles around yourself to make yourself, basically pretty impenetrable against anything short of an absolutely full-scale invasion. Yeah. Impenetrable when it comes to attempts by other potential adversaries to do you some harm in terms of your both either your landmass or your sea surrounds. And I think there's all sorts of ways at which defence experts are now talking about we can build that capability without relying on the to the extent that is involved in the AUKUS enterprise.
Yeah, I've had Sam on the show and talked to him about the echidna strategy, and it does strike me. No, I've never had any responsibility for defence or foreign policy or anything like that in my life, but if something's cheaper, more effective, more implementable, it's probably a better choice. So I can't quite see why we wouldn't go down the echidna strategy.
There's all sorts of assumptions are made about the invulnerability, the undetectability of these assets, which I just find impossible to believe in the time frame we're talking about, maybe now for the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years even, but for 30, 40, 50 years, which is the time horizon we're talking about, the notion that these things will be as undetectable as they are now, it's just not only nonsense, but what Jeremy Bentham once described as nonsense on stilts, but really special class of nonsense. But anyway,
very special kind of nonsense, yeah, and a very expensive kind of gold-plated stilts, perhaps. Well, what about the more Asia principle? And I mean, to some degree, you've talked about this. Like you talked about the Cambodia issue. It's been a very fundamental thing within Australian political, foreign policy, intellectual culture. I mean, I studied at ANU and I did my PhD at ANU, and my office was like, 2 doors down from Tony Milner. So it's something that's been part of Australian thinking culture, let's say, for a long time. But over the last 10 years or so, we've had the sort of Red China alert and, various, some people describe them as sort of dog whistling type pieces of political rhetoric about China. Even in the recent election, there was accusations about spies and all that kind of thing. And a lot of people feel we've somehow fell off the rails or went off the wagon on the sort of more Asia boat.
I think
what's your assessment of it?
Well, I think under Penny Wong, as foreign minister, we've been trying very much to clamber back on that wagon, and her sort of advocacy role in terms of rebuilding relationships of some sophistication and complexity with our Asian regional neighbours, the crucial ones, has really been pretty important and should absolutely come back to centre stage as the dominant theme in our conduct of international relations. I mean, I think the more Asia thing in my framing of it is it's got 3 dimensions. One is strengthening regional trade and economic integration relationships, that alphabet soup of RCEP and TPPs and so on, I mean, from which the Americans have walked away from or shown no interest in. It's really critical to build that cooperative resilience, particularly under threat from US tariffs and so on, and that's just got to be a central part of it, which I think is well understood by the present government. The second dimension is just developing much stronger political and to some extent military cooperation relationships with the key individual Asian countries, Indonesia, obviously India, Korea, and Japan, of the kind that we've been doing both bilaterally and unilaterally, but also, some of the other key ASEAN players, Vietnam in particular, very, very capable country. And there's the traditional relationships with Malaysia and Singapore and Thailand and the Philippines. But I think more than ASEAN collectively, building individual relationships with these countries is going to be a crucial part of our effective relationship with the region in the future. The third element of it is just rethinking and repositioning our relationship with China itself, treating it as, I think the threat stuff has been wildly overdrawn. There's no doubt that China is a threat to Taiwan, and that might take a kinetic form in the foreseeable future, although I think China is going to be very much more cautious about the implications of that domestically than a lot of people are prepared to acknowledge. And I doubt very much that things will blow up in the immediately foreseeable future, but that is a constant risk, certainly for Taiwan. And as a flourishing democracy, that is something to be deplored, although, of course, the reality is that has to be acknowledged is that Taiwan is just not accepted by the rest of the world as a sovereign country in the same way as Ukraine or Kuwait. So the dynamics there are different. But there is reason for concern also about China's activity in the South China Sea, which has been in complete indifference to international law of the sea, and the militarization of those reefs and so on has not been a happy story. But I think overall, the notion that China is a territorial threat to its neighbors or the wider region is completely overstated, and it would like a hegemonic relationship, would like a bit more kowtowing of the kind that's been traditional in Chinese history and culture. But the notion of it being an invasion threat of the kind that Japan was decades ago, I think is just a complete exaggeration. But so what we ought to be doing with China is not getting hysterical in the way that happened when Morrison Turnbull governments just went completely off the rails in that respect. But while certainly being willing to push back against any overreach in the region and participating in the Quad and all those things to make that messaging clear, while doing all of that and also making clear that we don't think it's in China's interests or in the interests of wider decency for it to be behaving as it is towards Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang, while making all those things clear. Nonetheless, it's perfectly possible for us to develop a much more constructive, multidimensional relationship with China, working with it on some of those big existential issues like climate change and, which we've already mentioned, climate, pandemics, and nuclear arms control, weapons control, in which I think China is prepared to be a cooperative player, and we can find common ground. So it's the other point I'd make is when we talk about more Asia, is to recognise the enormous resource we have with Asian Australians in our own community, Chinese Australians, and demonising them as some kind of fifth colonists is just wasn't only catastrophic politically for coalition in the recent election, but it's just completely nuts in terms of recognising the reality that we have with our Chinese community, with our Indian Australian community, as well as lots of other regional nationalities. We just have a wonderful resource. We have a linguistic resource. We have a cultural sensitivity resource. We have an access resource, which is being, supremely still underused. Bit by bit, we're gnawing away at it, but we've got to be very conscious of the necessity, for taking advantage of that. And one of the things I've been proudest of in my role at ANU is, establishing this Centre for Asian Australian Relations and trying to address quite specifically the bamboo ceiling that's been experienced by quite a lot of Chinese Australians when it comes not so much to occupying positions in the mainstream professions, but occupying leadership positions in public office, in public companies, and in the professional organisations. It's just a huge part of what it is now to be Australian, to recognise the reality that it's our geography that matters, it's not our history. We have a huge resource and we ought to be using it to advance that more Asia agenda that I broadly described.
Yep. And that obviously includes, India and the other South Asian countries, because, that group is now very large as well in Australia. So it's always struck me that, multicultural, one of Australia's real social achievements is multiculturalism is really sort of embedded in the psyche of the country in a way that doesn't seem to be in North America, doesn't seem to be in Europe, and that is a great asset for diplomacy. I would think.
It's always very dangerous to generalise about national characteristics and so on, but I think there is really something to be said about that Australian instinct for equality, the unwillingness to suck up, but also the unwillingness to kick down, that just does seem to be endemic somehow in the Australian psyche. I mean, and it's at its best demonstrated, I think, in the role that Australian peacekeepers have played in quite difficult and complex situations. Not that we've got many in the field at the moment. I think a grand total of about 60 personnel, whereas in the past we've had hundreds or even thousands on UN missions and so on. But when Australians have been in these peacekeeping situations in Africa and parts of Asia and elsewhere, where in dealing with communities that are completely sort of foreign to the Australians, they've nonetheless done themselves extremely proudly and won the respect of those communities by basically taking people as they found them, not being overly responsive to authority as such, but certainly not being in the slightest bit contemptuous or dismissive or hopelessly prejudiced against people lower down the pecking orders. And it's something that's always made me proudest when I was travelling and visiting these missions overseas, and it's a very great part of the Australian tradition. It's and I mean, goes back to my own sort of childhood, this sort of sense of the basic decency of Australians. I've told this story quite often, but my father was a tram driver, working class guy, full of, and this is, I'm talking now about the very early 1950s, full of the prejudices of the time, and in particular, I guess, the working class prejudices about, and I won't use the language, would shame Alf Garnett to use some of the descriptions he used to describe the various lesser breeds as he perceived them that were in danger of polluting the country if they ever came to anywhere near our shores. I mean, white Australia sort of personified. But, and here's the but, as a tram driver, he had a responsibility for teaching new people on the block to drive trams. And as successive waves of immigrants came to Australia, first of all Italians, then Greeks, and then the beginnings of a little bit of a trickle from sort of burghers from Sri Lanka, mixed blood people and so on. One by one, I remember as a little kid, my father coming home from a day's tram driving teaching, saying, well, you know what I think about Italians, but there's this little bloke called Luigi, little Luigi, lovely little fella. I was teaching how to drive a tram today. Really nice little bloke. And then a few months later, well, you know what I think about Greeks, but I had this little bloke Spiro just off the boat today, teaching him how to drive a tram. And lovely little bloke. And the reality was that as whatever the degree of prejudice there was in the abstract, in the distance, once he was exposed face to face with the reality of different cultures, different races and so on, he was absolutely, fundamentally decent, fundamentally responsive to them as individuals. And I think that's, again, you can't generalise about this, but I think it is a distinctive Australian characteristic and something that has made us a very successful multicultural country, and we should build on that strength and not run away from it in any way, shape or form, in the way that some sides of politics have shown a disposition to do.
On that theme of sort of, I guess, dialogue between cultures, I kind of wanted to ask a question around ways of seeing world order, because there's a lot of speculation at the moment about the end of the post-1945 world order or the American-led world order, that kind of thing. And I recently came across a book by Amitav Acharya, The Once and Future World Order, Why Global Civilization Will Survive the Decline of the West, where he says the end of the Western and US-led order need not mean global collapse and might actually be good for the world. The Western nations should adapt and learn to live with the rise of the West, working toward a global project of reconciliation and respect among nations and civilizations would be more productive than a futile last-ditch effort to resist change. I guess we can probably guess what the futile last-ditch effort is referring to. And I ordered this book the other week, and I saw that there's a blurb from you at the front of the book, Gareth, where you say that Professor Acharya's book is a timely corrective to the blinkered arrogance about the role of the West, which continues to infect so much Western policy analysis and history writing. And so I guess I've got a question in two parts. One is to look at the more optimistic side of that dialogue of respect, but the blinkered arrogance in Western policy analysis, history writing, maybe it's also affected aspects of the political leadership, even maybe diplomatic and military leadership of some countries. How do you see the political leaders? I mean, a lot of people speculate about decline of quality of political leadership, that sort of thing. How do you see that blinkered arrogance playing out? And have you perceived some sort of decline in the quality of diplomatic political leadership over the course of your career?
Well,
without going into good old days kind of stuff.
a lot of things wrapped up in that. But look, the starting point is to recognise, as Acharya does, that the tectonic plates have shifted. The world we're looking at is not the same world that it was in those immediate post-Cold War years when the Security Council leadership was constructed and the veto rights were given to a small group of players who continue to occupy those positions, when so many other players, particularly from the so-called global south, have completely changed their standing. I mean, China's rise is something we're all conscious of. India's is rapidly following suit. Indonesia is going to be a very, very, very important player, fourth biggest economy in the world. I think it's projected to be by 2050. And of course, similar things happening in Africa. Key players there, less obviously economically successful so far than China or India, but nonetheless coming up. Similarly, of course, with your Brazils and your Argentinas in Latin America, all of them clamoring for attention in the global order, and all of them pretty much excluded from key decision-making roles. And there's a natural instinct, and we're seeing this, of course, coming particularly loudly from China, to demand to be no longer just rule takers in that global order, but rule makers. And I think we've just got to come to terms with that reality. The implications of this for what we've known as the Western-dominated rules-based international order, I don't think are necessarily too troubling. I don't think it means the demise. The rise of the South and the rise of the rest doesn't mean the demise of international law respecting, international institution respecting world order. I think it is possible to see over time the evolution of a new structure to that order, in which a far greater role is played and there's far more prominence in executive agencies, management, and controlling bodies than is the case at the moment. There is this scope for a cooperative approach to institutional management and operation but if it's to happen, it's going to require, and this is the final point you made, it's going to require leadership. And leadership is something that, on the scale that's necessary to accommodate this change, is something that's been in pretty visibly short supply. I mean, I occasionally, during my own professional career, had glimpses of that leadership. I mean, of course, there was the Mandela type experiences. Some people who were just so big in terms of their stature and their credibility and their willingness to make new ways of thinking about dealing with old problems. There's a few people like that stand out. But even I remember Bill Clinton. Being in a function with him a couple of years after he left the US presidency in the early 2000s, just getting it instinctively right about what needed to happen in this changing environment, which has changed even more dramatically, of course, since then. What I remember him saying is this. I remember it quite vividly. He said, and it was to a private audience. He never said this publicly with anything like this degree of lucidity. He said, look, America's got two choices about the way in which we use this great and unrivaled economic and military power that we now have, then unrivaled, sure. Two ways in which we can use it. One is to create a world in which one is to use that power to try to stay top dog on the global block in perpetuity. Choice number one. Choice number two, however, is to create a world, and I remember that these were the exact words he used, to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we're no longer top dog on the global block. And I thought that was absolutely pitch perfect. And if that kind of sentiment could prevail with the current US leadership, which is at the opposite end of the spectrum from that, but if it could also prevail in other Western centres in the EU and UK and so on, we would be in a better place. But it does require that sort of that largeness of spirit, that largeness of mindset, which has been conspicuously lacking. I live in hope that it can be recreated, and I live in hope that countries like Australia can make their own contribution to creating a mindset of cooperative security and an approach to the global order that doesn't depend on Western dominance, Western supremacy, let alone Western primacy or US primacy. But it's going to be very hard work, and I think we're certainly going to have to put it on the back burner for the next 4 years with the Trump administration, because I can't see any way forward in terms of this aspiration, so long as this intellectually and morally challenged solipsistic vulgarian remains in the White House.
Indeed. One thing about a mindset is most of us never get anywhere near the diplomatic halls of power, but at least we can change our mindset. And Amitav Acharya's book, I think, makes the point that the Western led rules-based order is actually a product of many cultures and many nations sort of blending their different experience over time. It's not all Western, and perhaps just more people realising that is perhaps a good start. Thank you so much for your time, Gareth. It's been an incredibly wonderful and insightful conversation. We are talking on the 8th of May. It's just a few days after the Australian federal election. It would probably be remiss of me, certainly for my Australian viewers, not to most of the viewers are overseas, but and there has been quite a bit of international commentary on the Australian election in terms of interpreting what it means vis-a-vis Trump and things like that. But I wonder if you maybe just want to finish the conversation with some parting words of advice, perhaps, to I think the new foreign minister will be, or the ongoing foreign minister will be sworn in next week, or will be announced next week. What should that foreign minister, who we assume will be Senator Penny Wong, what should be top of her mind in thinking about this changing world?
Well, obviously, I think standing tall in the face of considerable challenges coming from the United States, standing tall both in defence of Australia's own immediate interests, yes, and not succumbing to the pressures to patsy up to this administration in a way that is demeaning or undermining of those core interests. And I think holding the line and doing so with grace and with appropriate politeness, you don't have to be aggressive, you don't have to be offensive, but you can't be steamrolled in this environment. And I don't think there will be any disposition for that to happen any more than there was with the Canadians, but handling it the way that Carney has recently done, and his remarkably successful appearance in the White House is not a bad role model for us. But my basic storyline, for Australian foreign policy, and what I've been pressing for years, and what I still continue to press with Penny Wong and the Australian government that continue in office, is do think more broad-mindedly about what Australia's national interests are and about how our foreign policy should be shaped and articulated. Don't just think of it in terms of advance of our security interests, protection of our security interests. Don't just think of it in terms of advancement and protection of our economic interests. Also think of it in terms of the absolute critical importance of being seen to be a good international citizen, the kind of country that cares about other people around the world who are suffering from poverty or from conflict or human rights violations, and doing the best we can in cooperation with other like-minded countries to improve that position. And taking that position, as I've said before, not just as a moral imperative, but taking it as a national interest imperative, because the truth of the matter is there are hard-headed returns. Hard-headed returns in terms of reputation, soft power, hard-headed returns in terms of reciprocity, people being willing to help us with our problems that might not otherwise have occurred to them because we've helped them with their problems. Interests in terms of getting stuff done on those big existential risk issues, those big global and regional public goods issues where nothing can be done by individuals, however big and powerful. It does require cooperative, collective action, and being the kind of country that people want to trust and respect and live in and sort of travel to and invest in and study in. To be that kind of country is something that is really to our advantage. It shouldn't just be sort of an optional extra in foreign policy. It should be a core dimension of that foreign policy. So, I think one of the many things that was said about the Labor government in its first term under Albanese is that we could be doing a bit more to articulate a vision of what kind of country we want to be. And while there's all sorts of domestic dimensions to that in terms of treatment of our Indigenous peoples and treatment of the economically under stress, socially under stress, there's an important international dimension as well. And I think it would be very important for Australia to articulate, Australian government to articulate as part of its vision for the future, and something that's really quite consistent with what Albanese is very genuinely described as the desire to be a kind country in terms of treating those who have been left behind internally by the present system. Entirely consistent with that. I think it would be wonderful if we could very explicitly articulate as a key aspiration for us this desire to be and to be seen to be a good international citizen, desire to be and be seen to be a decent country. So that's something I'll continue to beat the drum about. Whether it'll have any resonance, I don't know. But there is something we can be proud of in this country about what we've managed to achieve in the past, when the better angels of our nature have been deployed. And I'd like to see that a more central part of our international action in the future.
Well, I think that's a wonderful closing message. And I would like to see that too. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and time with me, Gareth Evans. And good luck with, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate the opportunity.